Hello, you've reached SJ Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm really excited that I am here with Dr. Braxton Hunter, who is the president of the Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary in Evansville, Indiana, and he is actually sitting in his office right now. I'm sure that when you're looking at this, you all thought the same thing I did, that he was in a gigantic house. But instead, this is his office. I think it's quite impressive.
Welcome to my office.
And he is and I've been noticing him lately on YouTube. He's got a very busy channel. He responds to a lot of people. He talks to Christians. He talks to atheists. He gets on people's channels and discusses hot topics with them. Like I just caught him a little bit on Shannon Q's channel. And he debated Matt Dillahunty, which is, wow. That's pretty great. And I heard part of that debate. I heard part of that this morning. I also heard your responses. I read or listened to your responses to all of those 15 YouTubers. So it was one Christian talking to 15 YouTubers, and that was really great. So I'm super excited to have you here. And I just wanted to see if you could share a little information about yourself. I'm going to post links in the description, but I don't have them there quite yet. But I'll be posting links to all of your sites.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So I am the president of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, trinitysem.edu, trinitysem.edu. And I have been since 2015. And we're a school that is focused on evangelism. So our apologetics programs are a little bit different from those you might get at some other schools that are known for apologetics, because we want to gear everything towards seeing people come to faith in Christ. So while we know that apologetics has other uses, that's our principal goal, is using it for the purposes of evangelism. And so if you're interested, I don't mean to make this an infomercial, but if you're interested in a bachelor's, master's, doctoral program, an associate's degree, we'd love for you to contact us through our website. And we just signed an articulation agreement with another school, Calvary University. And so you can go from here to Calvary, and you have a lot of options. So, but I'm probably more known to, not that I'm that well known at all, but to people that might be watching right now, because I have a YouTube channel, Trinity Radio. That's called Trinity Radio because it's kind of unofficially the radio, the YouTube channel and podcast for our school. And you can find that at youtube.com/Braxton Hunter. And, but that's who I am. And I'm really honored. I wanted to say real quick, I'm really honored to be here with you as well, because I was kind of unaware until I started preparing for the Matt Dillahunty debate, how much of this kind of underground rap battle, atheist-theist debate scene there was. And whenever I found channels like Modern Day Debate and things like that, I saw you on there moderating, and I saw you popping up everywhere I looked on Twitter, and people quoting you and atheists quoting you and putting snarky comments about what you say. And I thought, hey, this is apparently somebody who's making headway in this realm. So I'm honored to be on your show.
Oh, thank you so much. I try, but it sometimes doesn't turn out so well, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great. So, and I'm really excited that you're coming on here. And you mentioned before, I think you have friendships with some other people. Like I've had Mike Winger on my channel before, which I'm pretty excited about. And I've had some pretty famous people like Hugh Ross and a couple of other people like Fuzz Rana. And actually I could go on, Lydia McGrew. I had Mike Licona. So I've had some pretty neat people on my channel. And so you're on that same, you're on their level and I'm on the lower level.
I'm not. No, I'm not on that high a level, but I have become friends with a few of those YouTubers you mentioned. And Mike Licona, it's funny you mentioned Mike. He's been a friend for like over 10 years. The other day when they put me up against Gary Habermas on that, March Madness apologist March Madness thing they do on Twitter. And I won by 2 percentage points, I think, on Gary Habermas. But before I won, I said, you know what, even if I lose, I have this to hold on to. One time I was at Mike Licona's house and Gary Habermas made my coffee. And so I have that to hold on to. But just yesterday, Mike's been with David Wood and Tim Stratton and the guy from 1 Minute Apologist. They've all been in Israel. And I was on that same trip with that group, different people, but the same organization 2 years ago. And so, and I got really sick in Tel Aviv on the way back and vomited just everywhere and in the airport. And Mike Licona, eminent New Testament scholar, Oxford published author, sent me a picture of the airport and said, "You remember this place? You were throwing up all over everything the last time you were here."
Oh, that's great. You know, I just saw that yesterday. I saw David Wood broadcasting from Tel Aviv.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's
Really cool.
fantastic.
When I got to go, William Lane Craig was there, and to have breakfast every day with William Lane Craig was just like an apologist dream, you know?
Oh my gosh, yeah. And as talk about when you're preparing for any debate, if you look at anything by William Lane Craig, I think that I think he puts the fear of God in atheists. In fact, I heard atheists have said that.
Oh yeah, yeah. You know, there are some close calls, but I don't know that I can ever say that I think he's really like obviously lost. I mean, everybody points to the Sean Carroll debate. I can't say that he lost there. You know, it's kind of like almost a stereotype that people like me would be huge William Lane Craig fanatics. Yeah, I am. I embrace it, but I've also found him to be a lovely man when I've been with him, and hope that I can call him a friend. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And he's another one. Now I've had Gary Habermas on my channel too, which I'm pretty excited about.
Wow.
But I've never had William Lane Craig or Frank Turek. That's another one I listen to sometimes because I think Frank is really good with those punchy one-liners.
Yeah, yeah, he's fantastic. I was just quoting him this morning. I was talking to someone, you know, I commonly say on my show, if God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead, Christianity is true, period. Whatever you want to say about secondary doctrines or, you know, doctrinal perspectives or in the inerrancy of Scripture. And occasionally I'll have someone say, oh, you know, that's disingenuous because some God could exist and raise Jesus from the dead and Christianity still not be true. And I'll always quote Frank Turek there. Look, I have a principle for my life. If a man rises from the dead, I believe whatever he says.
He comes up with some really good ones, I have to admit.
Right.
No, that's great. And there was something else I wanted to ask you before I forget, because you mentioned your college and it's in Evansville, Indiana, which not everybody can travel to. Do you happen to have online programs too?
Yeah, in fact, we're 100% online. Our school's existed since 1969. We're in our 50th anniversary right now. And it was one of the early, they used to call it correspondence or distance learning schools. They used to send video, you know, cassette tapes or VHSs and all that. And we were one of the pioneer schools in online education. And so we were one of the first schools of any kind to do online stuff like this. And so, so it's 100% online. You can take courses in your pajamas, and you don't have to want to be a professional minister or a professional theologian or something. We have a lot of people that, for lack of better terminology, are lay learners who just want to go further.
Wow. I didn't even know that it was 100% online, or even that you've been around for so long. That's truly amazing, because that seems like lately all the colleges, or so many colleges, are going that way, but it's neat to be a pioneer.
Oh yeah. And this whole thing, I know you don't want this whole thing to be about Trinity, but I will say right now I'm in a program at another school that is a well-known accredited, you know, school in Georgia that's well-known, but they have the same format we do in their online programs, but you might get, you know, you know, maybe an hour of video lecture. We require 8 hours of video content for original from us for every course. And so you're really going to get a lot of proprietary stuff, and you're going to get to know your professor that way. So we're proud of what we've got here.
That's great. Now, if we're talking about evangelism, and one of the things that you mentioned, Gary Habermas, and I think about his minimal facts argument, and then I think about things like undesigned coincidences from Lydia McGrew, and she feels that that's even superior to the minimal facts. And I know there are other arguments for Jesus's resurrection, but at your university, what do people think are some of the best arguments in favor of Jesus's resurrection?
Well, you know, Gary Habermas has made the minimal facts approach famous, but some form of a minimal facts approach has commonly been, you know, it doesn't, he kind of mastered that, and he's done phenomenal things with it. But, you know, Craig has his minimal facts that are not he doesn't have as many as Habermas does. Licona throws out some. I don't think he has the same number. N.T. Wright has 3, but one of those breaks out into 7 differences in the ways that early Christians worshipped and changed the way, you know, overnight had this change. So the minimal facts is made famous by Gary Habermas, but I think there are a lot of ways you can play with that. And Habermas has even changed. He used to say, okay, here's 12 or 14 facts, and take any 7 you want. But sometimes he'll do any 6 you want or whatever. So you can be flexible with that. But I think for my money, my case that I think is successful. And we teach all of these at the school. But the one that I think is the best, because I'm a classical apologist, and I usually think it's helpful to begin with theistic arguments for God's existence, because to my mind, and of course, this is a debate between people like Craig and people like Habermas, that you can actually read in the book 5 Views on Apologetics from Zondervan's Counterpoint series. It's fun because Craig and Habermas kind of go back and forth a little bit there in debate methodology. But I like to start with God's existence, because I feel like if you have a God to raise Jesus from the dead, well, then the resurrection becomes more plausible. I say it kind of recalibrates the plausibility for the discussion. And so I do a theistic argument or two. And then with the stuff about Jesus specifically, I like to point to the fact that Jesus thought of himself as God's eschatological agent, or agent to bring about the kingdom of God. And that is something that universally scholars agree upon. I always have to qualify, when we say universally scholars agree upon something, there's always outliers, but overwhelmingly, scholars agree that Jesus thought of himself at least as God's special agent to bring about the kingdom. So it's as if Jesus was walking around during his life saying, just watch my life and see what happens. So whenever you take something like that, then you add the rest of the case, which I go with, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that the earliest disciples had experiences that they interpreted as appearances of the risen Christ, and then their willingness to die for those claims. I think those are great, but I think when you begin with God's existence and what Jesus thought about himself, the whole case sings. And I presented that in the debate with Matt Dillahunty, and I can talk more about that too, because if you want, because I'm really passionate about that, and came up with an analogy that I think really works well with it, but people can get that on my stuff if they want to go further with it.
Oh, I'd like to hear that. If you want to just share a little bit of it, that'd be great.
Yeah. So you often hear people say, the old Carl Sagan thing, and I think Sagan got it from somebody else, but extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So
yes.
Yeah, we hear that all the time. And typically apologists will take issue with that and say something like, well, extraordinary claims require sufficient evidence. And I like how Licona says it. What do you mean extraordinary evidence? Does it glow? What are you looking for here? But I actually tackle it a little bit of a different way. And people love to attack this analogy instead of the point of the analogy. And I have a whole show on this that people can go check out. But basically it's like this. All right. So I think we can recalibrate the plausibility. I agree that if we don't have any reason to believe there's anything special about Jesus, or we don't have any reason to believe that God exists, or we don't have a reason to believe in the supernatural, then sure, why should we conclude that Jesus rose from the dead? But let's think about this. If I've already given a couple of theistic arguments, which I would by this point in the discussion, and so I've already established God as a likely God likely exists. There's good reason to believe he exists. All right. And then we can show that Jesus thought of himself as God's special agent to bring about the kingdom. I don't even have to establish that Jesus claimed he was going to die and rise from the dead or anything like that. Just that he thought of himself as God's special kingdom agent. All right. This is the analogy I give. All right. If you walked into a coffee shop and a group of people said to you, SJ, I don't even know what I'm supposed to call you. Is it SJ? Do I call you SJ?
Great.
Okay. And said, SJ, listen, we just saw this guy named Neil walking on the moon. Can you believe it? We saw this guy walking on the moon. Now, let's imagine, for the sake of this analogy, that you don't know anything about space travel. You don't know anything about NASA or the moon landing or anything else. And that you're not one of those 1 in 6 people who just still don't believe that we went to the moon, right?
1 in 6? Oh, man.
Yeah, that's what I hear. So, all right. So let's just say you don't know anything about NASA. This ever happened. Now, that's going to sound like an extraordinary claim that a man walked on the moon. That's absurd, right? Okay, so you've got that. But then later that day, you find out that there is this organization called NASA that is capable of doing something like putting a man on the moon. So you find that out, that there's a power that could do something like putting a man on the moon, NASA. And then you find out that there was this guy in the 1960s named Neil who was claiming that he was a part of NASA's special program, whatever that is. So now you've got the force, NASA, that could put someone on the moon, and the guy named Neil claiming that he was a part of that program. So now the claims from the coffee shop crowd that say we saw it are not extraordinary anymore. Now you can believe it. Now it makes sense. In fact, it's the most plausible explanation. So the parallel is, Like NASA is the force capable of putting someone on the moon. If you have God in play, God is a force capable of raising a man from the dead. If he can create a universe from nothing, he could raise a man from the dead. And similarly, Jesus is like Neil in that he's claiming to be a part of God's special program to bring about the kingdom. And so now when you hear the after the fact claims that we typically hear in a resurrection case, like that Jesus died, that people claim that, all those things, their claims are more likely to be true. And actually the most plausible explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. So I call that recalibrating plausibility. You kind of, you're taking more facts, before the facts into the consideration. And I think it makes the claim more likely. So that's how that works.
I think that's great. I like that analogy because I think a lot of people, if we go back 50 years, 60 years, people would be dumbfounded. What do you mean somebody's walking on the moon or someone's about to walk on the moon? Go back to 1969. So
right. That's right.
Yeah, no, that's a great argument. Stephen Rivard is in the chat here, and he's mentioning something I think is a really good question. He says, why don't more apologists focus on the carbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls to prove that the Old Testament was written before Jesus was even born, then show how many Old Testament passages point towards Jesus? And the prophecies idea, which I think is a fantastic argument. I know some don't, but I like that.
No, I think it's great too. And, Mike Winger devotes a lot of space to talking about the prophecy. So if someone's interested in that, they should go check out Mike Winger's channel. And I think he has a series on that. Me personally, that's just not been a specific area of particular interest to me, which is odd, I have to admit, because he's absolutely right. The Dead Sea Scrolls predate Jesus' ministry, and yet we have these Essenes who, I remember when I've been to Israel 3 times, and when you go there, they say, when you go to visit the Qumran community where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they'll say it's almost like these guys were walking around with scrolls just falling off their body everywhere because we have such a wealth from them. And it is great, and you can go see them, you can go view them. And he's right; it puts those prophecies prior to the life of Jesus. So if you find it at all compelling that these prophecies seem, to have fulfillment in Jesus, well, what it takes off the table is the idea that these were, people came in and monkeyed with the text to make it look right for Jesus. So I agree with him. In fact, I'm personally convicted. I should spend more time studying those prophecies. I think that's fantastic.
I do too. And I'll just mention something. I've been doing a lot of work looking into Daniel 9, and Daniel 9 actually predicts the timing of Jesus's crucifixion when you look into it. And if you look at Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22 and Zechariah 12:10, they all talk about Jesus's crucifixion and allude to the resurrection. So I think just those alone, let alone the other 326 that I understand are in there. So There's great stuff out there.
Yeah, I agree. That's a really good point. So yeah, I think we should look into that more. But if someone out there wanted to right now get more on that, again, I think that Winger's done a great job.
I agree. And actually, Winger did something, have you heard of the person called Aaron Ra?
Yes, I'm familiar with Aaron Ra.
So, well, Mike Winger did a couple of response videos to Aaron, and I thought those are really good too. He was talking about Tyre, and he went against some of the things that Aaron said about Tyre. So I thought I would definitely recommend people go to Mike's channel, which is becoming extremely popular too. He's got like 90,000 subscribers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. He's one of the tops there. Now, this is me looking at the chat. I don't know if I'm supposed to do that, but I see here someone's doing exactly what I predicted we would see happen, which is to criticize the analogy rather than the point of the analogy. So someone here says NASA exists and evidence, including video of Neil walking on the moon, exists. What a ridiculous analogy. Well, the point is not the type of evidence that we have. We have great historical evidence that Jesus thought of himself as God's eschatological agent. And I would give a great theistic argument for God's existence. So I agree that these are different types of evidence, but there's still evidence on both sides. And so the analogy, I think, still works. So
I do too. That's Paul who just said that, I guess. So there was another thing I wanted to ask you, because you've mentioned a couple of times that you have pretty good evidence for God. Do you use the Kalam Cosmological argument, or is it the design argument? What do you use?
Yeah, well, I have a book on this called Core Facts that's aimed at people who don't already have a robust understanding of these arguments, and it's kind of more aimed at a lay person, but you still have to try to understand it. You have to want to understand. And then I have a more expanded book called Evangelistic Apologetics, and there I go through a lot of the standard theistic arguments that would include the design argument and the Kalam. But for me personally, I do think, I mean, I know, just like people would say, well, you're just a William Lane Craig fanatic. Some people that are kind of hipster apologists think that the Kalam is kind of overplayed, but I'm sorry. I think that the Kalam cosmological argument is so fantastic that, we're always cautioned in apologetic circles, and we caution our students not to overstate your case. And I think that's fair. We should do that. But to me, the Kalam cosmological argument is as close to a slam dunk that I think we could get for my money. Now, I understand that for a lot of people, the design argument, and when you have the evidence of nature all around you, that it's just hard. It's hard to escape the impression of design. And then when you look at the numbers and all of that, that is very persuasive. And I know even many atheists have said that though they're atheists, the design, the teleological arguments are their favorite. But for me, the Kalam is just fantastic. So I use that in my debate with Dillahunty. I did something that I didn't want to do the standard fare. I wanted to throw something out there that would be somewhat unique. And so I devoted space to an argument from free will. And I've never seen anyone do it quite the way I did it. And it was interesting because in the comments of that debate, you can go right now and go look at on my channel, the comments, and what you'll see is some skeptics saying, oh, this is just the same stuff. We've heard all this stuff before, nothing new. And sometimes in the same comment, they'll say, and I hate this free will argument that I've never heard of before. It's like, you just said that this is all the standard fare, and then you admit that there's something new here that you've never heard before, but I still say that even though I like my free will argument, I think the Kalam is the top shelf argument for me.
I think I like the Kalam a lot, actually. And my pastor was who shared that with me first. That was where I first heard that from the pastor. So I thought that was pretty fantastic. And I didn't know, I hadn't really studied much about the Big Bang. And I think that probably in 1925, when that all started coming about, that probably put a lot of atheists into very uncomfortable positions because they'd been arguing for an eternal existence. And so this idea that we have a start date probably set them back a little bit.
Right. So that's one great thing about it, is that there's scientific stuff that backs it up, but I typically rely more on the philosophical stuff. And, Craig himself, who's the modern champion of the Kalam, says that that the philosophical stuff is actually the principal and best case for the Kalam. And the thing about it is, so many people will say, well, these scientists don't agree with you. These scientists don't buy it and all that. Yeah, but at base, it's a philosophical question. Science takes us to the limits of the natural universe, but science, that's what it studies, the natural universe. So if you want to talk about the cause of the physical universe coming into existence, you have to involve philosophy. And so I always think that misses the mark so fabulously. But I love the Kalam, and I typically use the philosophical, but it is beautiful in that you can include scientific data that backs it up as well. And the past infinite universe that you just referenced, I think, is an impossibility. And I've yet to hear a compelling response to the impossibility of a past infinite universe.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I love that argument too. And there's a lot of different ways to look at it, because you could even go back and talk about infinite regression and this whole idea of where does the buck stop? And so right. I think a lot of that, like Aquinas, I think it was Aquinas who said that kind of stuff. I want to ask you before I forget, can I ask you about this free will argument that you said? Because I don't know if, I don't think I've heard that. So. Oh
yeah. Okay, sure. Yeah. I'll kind of break it out for you now. I'll say right from the jump, and I don't know where you stand on secondary issues, but there are many Calvinists who would, I don't know if you're a Calvinist, but there are many Calvinists. Oh, okay. Well, then you'll probably be fine with it.
But, I'm a Molinist. If I had to pick something, I'd say I'm a Molinist.
Great. Okay, great. I'm a Molinist. I don't use Molinism to answer any soteriological questions, though I used to, but I'm a Molinist because I believe indirectly the Bible strongly implies that God knows what would have happened under other circumstances. But anyway, so with the free will argument, not many Calvinists may be able to use this, but it revolves around the question of whether determinism is true or libertarian freedom is true. Compatibilism is often considered to be a middle of the road between determinism, which just says no free will, and libertarian freedom that says free will, that you could have done other than whatever you ended up doing and or nothing external to you determines your actions. So compatibilism is often thought to be in the middle. And Matt Dillahunty, until my debate with him, had always said he was a compatibilist. Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist. But compatibilism is determinism. So you can still think binary about this. There's only two options on the table: determinism or libertarian freedom. Compatibilism just uses the language of freedom and points out that we're free within the realm of our nature, but you're still, every action you take is determined. So you got determinism and libertarian freedom. So the argument would be, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. All right. So that's premise one, and I'm ready to defend it. And then premise two is libertarian freedom does exist. And then the conclusion is, therefore, God exists. Now, it's similar to Craig's moral argument, which says if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. Now, there, Craig has the understanding that most people are going to grant premise two, that objective moral values and duties do exist. Likewise, in my argument, I'm granting that, and I have the data to support that the vast majority of the population believes they have libertarian freedom, whether they know that's what to call it or not. So premise two with the average population is going to be uncontroversial and is really the strength of the argument. With academically minded determinists, they're not going to grant premise two. And so I have to defend premise two as well. So to run through it again, if God does not exist, libertarian freedom does not exist. Libertarian freedom does exist, therefore God exists. So I would defend those, and real briefly, I'll just kind of show you how I would defend those. So I would defend those with premise one: if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. It seems that most of the atheist determinists out there would actually grant me this premise. They may not be willing to grant that if God exists, it would allow for libertarian freedom, but they will grant, most of them, I think it's like 70-something%. There was a study of philosophers and their perspectives that I quote in several episodes. If you want the direct stuff, it's in the first response I did to Matt Dillahunty. That's just me without my co-host, but I gave all this data and quoted the journal articles. But most of your atheist determinist philosophers, are determinists, which seems to lend credibility to the idea that if you're an atheist, you're more than likely going to be a determinist. And if you're not an atheist, you're more than likely going to not be a determinist, because the vast population isn't atheistic and it does believe in libertarian freedom. So they're with me on this. If God does not exist, then the universe is a natural system of cause and effect. There is no ghost in the machine. If naturalism is true, it is all just causal, normal causal relations. And so there just isn't a way to get libertarian freedom. There are some people out there that are arguing that quantum physics might be able to supply you with an opportunity and all that. But for the most part, it seems understandable and somewhat non-controversial that if there is no God, you don't have libertarian freedom. All right. So premise one, I think, is pretty secure, and I've got some other defenses for it, but for time's sake, I think premise one's pretty good. Premise two, that libertarian freedom does exist. Now there, I was criticized by Dillahunty, or characterized by him after the debate, as having said, well, it just has to be true because I so feel that it is true, which wasn't at all, wasn't at all what I was saying. The reason he thought that, and I'm sorry if I'm sucking all the air out of the room, I'm trying to make this brief.
No, this is great.
Okay. So with free will, with the libertarian freedom, one of the reasons, and I think the reason he got that impression is, Richard Swinburne, in his argument from religious experience, uses what's called the principle of credulity. And the principle of credulity is the idea that if something seems to me almost impossible to doubt, then I'm justified in holding it until such a time as overwhelming evidence is presented to show me that I'm wrong. Now, Dillahunty called that a fallacy in the debate, but it simply isn't a fallacy. And if it is a fallacy, he committed the same fallacy moments later when he said, I think that I exist. I have this, overwhelming sense that I exist. And I think I'm justified in that until someone gives me overwhelming reason to think that I don't exist. So, but anyway, so I do think that. I think I have this almost impossible to doubt sense that I have libertarian freedom. Until someone gives me overwhelming evidence that I'm wrong, I'm going to keep believing that, and I'm justified and have a warrant in believing that. That's one thing. The second thing is, if libertarian freedom does not exist, then rational affirmations cannot exist. And here's what I mean by that. Rationality is related to reason. And it has to do with this concept that rationality or reason is the process by which we think about data that's coming in. We think about things that we're considering, and then we choose which thing we should affirm instead of something else. But what people don't understand is that if determinism is true, it's not just your actions that are determined, but even your thoughts and beliefs are determined as well. So that you have no justification for rationally affirming anything that you believe. You can affirm things, but you can't rationally affirm them. And if you can't rationally affirm them, you may be right, but you can't know that you're right. And so knowledge claims are gone. And there's a great analogy from Tim Stratton on this. He says, imagine that right now you discovered that there's a mad scientist who is determining your every thought, action, and beliefs, including the next words that are coming out of your mouth and what you're thinking right now as I'm talking. If you found out a mad scientist was determining all of that, would you have any justification for believing or trusting anything that you say or think? You wouldn't, because someone else is controlling your thoughts. On determinism, on naturalistic atheism, it's even worse than that, because there's not even a mad scientist. It's just, the random, unguided processes of the universe. So all that to say, if you take determinism to be true, you can't have rational affirmations, but we think we can have rational affirmations. So determinism is probably false. And then lastly on that, I would say that if determinism is true, it results in what we call moot morality. Whether or not you think objective morality exists or not, if determinism is true, you can't help but to do whatever you're doing. So if you become a benevolent, person who goes and builds wells for thirsty people in some third world country, or you become a racial hater, in either case, you're doing what you were determined to do and could not have done otherwise. So you can't hold anyone morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. But we all know that morality is not moot in that way, and no one lives their life like that. So determinism's out and libertarian freedom is in. So the argument, I think, goes through and God exists.
I like that argument. And I wanted to piggyback on some of your points there, because I think the idea of libertarian freedom is also the idea that I'm going to take accountability for my own actions. Right. And I feel like determinism, biological determinism, and I've read some of that with Sam Harris's book. And I think Daniel Dennett mentioned some of this whole idea with biological determinism, but it's the idea of taking away accountability for some of your actions and trying to pretend that everything's been predetermined in your cells. And I can agree to a certain extent. Like when you learn to walk, for example, some of the things that you memorize, you learn to pick up a spoon, you learn to eat, and that kind of thing. I think those very low level skills that people learn are, there's some determinism a little bit in that, but then going to the higher level of reasoning, as you mentioned, that's where I am a libertarian free person who believes in the freedom.
Well, I think you hit on a really relevant point here. One of the great evidences that determinists will trot out to defend the position of determinism are what are called Libet experiments. This guy ran an experiment where he showed that, and that modern iterations of it use two buttons in front of a person, and they say, choose which of these buttons you're going to pick. And the light above that button will go off before the person clicks it, presumably showing that we were able to determine what you were going to do by brain activity before you even became aware of which thing you were going to choose. Therefore, free will does not exist. But Libet himself, the original guy who came up with this and ran the original experiment, said, yes, but what we found was that there is, I forget the numbers, but let's just say 300 millisecond window where you can refrain from choosing. So perhaps there is some determinism in the sense that you're about to choose something, but then you have this, I forget what he called it, but this refusal period where you can refrain and not do what you were about to do. I think this makes so much sense of biblical Christianity, because we have a nature that prompts us to do certain things, but we can refrain from those actions. So maybe you don't think we have free will, but according to the Libet experiments, you do have free won't, which means you have free will. So you can choose not to do a certain thing. So I think that's really powerful and gets left out of a lot of these discussions.
Yeah, I like that. In free won't. Yeah. I agree with a lot of those points. And I'm just trying to think of some of the other things that I wanted to mention on that same level, and I'm forgetting.
Yeah, and while you're thinking that through, I could just add really quickly this, that there is a serious difference, and you hit on it, between picking, what we could call picking, and choosing. if I'm picking which button to push, or I'm picking, whether I'm going to have, orange juice or water, I'm picking, these are not really high level deals, but choosing where I'm really, who am I going to marry? What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to respond to what she just said? These are not the same as those low level cognitions. I'm actually wrestling with this and trying to determine, and that's a whole different thing. And Libet experiments don't even approach this issue of choosing. So I would just add that to the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's good. That reminds me of that actually was what I was going to say. I was thinking about mental models and schemas and this idea of cognitivism, and the idea that as you grow older, initially you start out with very simple mental models, and you grow older, things become more sophisticated and your reasoning becomes more sophisticated. And so at that point, you get to the choosing level, you're at the higher level of reasoning. And so then I think trying to make an argument that we're determined at this very high level, to me, it doesn't make any sense.
Sure. Yeah.
Sorry for the Calvinists if they feel.
No, that's okay. And honestly, what every non-Calvinist and libertarian person that I'm aware of would say is we do have strong influences in this world. So if I addict myself to nicotine, that is going to be a strong influence that is going to really make it difficult for me to actually give up that nicotine. But now that is actually a difference between a different thing from having free will. Oftentimes people will say, look, you've got a man's nature. You can't freely choose to fly like a bird. You don't have a bird nature. Well, now that's true. I can't actually fly like a bird, but I can freely will to fly like a bird. I can say my will is to fly like a bird, whether I can do it or not. So this is a very deep discussion, and it's one of my favorite things. Actually, the way I arrived at it is I used to do debates with Calvinists within theological circles. I have 4 debates with Calvinists on my channel that people can go check out. And my co-host has a debate on Calvinism. But I felt like I really needed to be focusing on evangelism toward people that are not yet believers. And so I left that, but then I prayed and asked God, and I really believe this is an answer to prayer. I asked God to reveal to me some way that I could use the knowledge I'd gained from the Calvinism debates for apologetics toward atheists. And I think this free will argument was an answer to that prayer.
I think that's great. And I think it's neat coming up with different arguments. My favorite, and you mentioned it, one of my favorites is the moral argument. but I know that is a very difficult one to bring out to people. I know there are some people who argue that morality is relative, but I think that you can't say that when you just consider something as basic as the true evil that we saw in the Nazi war. And so I think that we have the base point. That was objectively wrong, and then we can build from that.
I love the moral argument. I do. I really do. I don't think that it is as clinching to a lot of people as as some of these other arguments, but I'm a big fan of the moral argument. And I have a video on it on my channel, a topical video. But no, just recently I did a response video, and there was an atheist in that video who, when that question was posed, what about some of these things I won't name so that you can remain monetized, but some of these horrendous things that we can imagine that happen, wouldn't you say that's objectively immoral? And this particular atheist said, I feel that it is. Everything inside of me is screaming that it's objectively immoral, but I just can't, if I'm going to be consistent, bring myself to say it. Now that atheist
is the flesh versus the spirit and the conscience.
That's right. That's right. And this particular atheist told me privately that this person has changed their approach. Nevertheless, that's what's going on at base, and it shows the incredible potency of the moral argument. So I think you're right to love that argument.
Yeah, I really do. I've written a lot of papers on it, and I've done a lot of investigations, because some people might say, well, do we have objective moral values and duties? And the duties one is the clincher, because that's prescriptive, so it can't be explained in our biological composition. And so if we look into the duties and you look into these global studies, you find that there are many global studies that say no matter what the world religion is, or even atheism and humanism, we all have this duty to do something similar to obeying the golden rule, or follow the golden rule. And whether or not we do it, I mean, sometimes we know we have the duty, but we might not follow that. But we all have this innate sense within us that we need to do well for others.
Absolutely. That's an undeniable thing, and everyone recognizes that. When I was responding to the 15 atheists in that channel, which Steve McRae wanted me to specified to me. He said, well, now I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic. So I was okay, well, it's 1 against 14 then. But the thing is, one of them in there, I forget which one it was, said, where do you get your basis for morality? And he could mean a couple of different things for that. My ontological basis is the nature of God, but in terms of like my awareness of morality, same place he gets it. It's written on our hearts, right? It's intuitively obvious to us. Now, there are complex ethical questions and moral questions that are difficult, but that's because we live in a complex world. But absolutely, it's certainly true. I get mine from the same place you get yours. And so we have that same basis because it's intuitively known and written on our hearts. That's why what you said is true. We can all say that we should do the golden rule. Yeah,
I agree. And I just want to build on that, the idea of the base, because I've debated a lot of atheists and listened to a lot of atheists, and a lot of them try to ground it. They try to ground the base in consequentialism or even utilitarianism, which is basically saying the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But yet you can't take the grounding and the goal and say they're one and the same, because that's basically circular. And so you,
right. Yeah, and it's still ultimately subjective, right? I mean, what if I don't care that that's how you want to ground it? Someone I recently heard saying, look, there are some people who think that human beings are a plague on this planet, and it would be better if there were far fewer human beings or no human beings so that nature could proliferate. So those people might think it's best if we obliterate the human race, or at least not continue. Maybe we should all sterilize ourselves or something. Well, that would be in the face of the atheist who says it's about the well-being of mankind. So all of these are subjective basis. Now, somebody like Matt Dillahunty, since we were talking about him earlier, it gets a little creative with this and says, okay, well, maybe it's like the game of chess. The game of chess is a subjectively created game, but within the game, there are objectively good and objectively bad moves if the goal is to win that game of chess. Well, okay, but what if I don't care that you want to play chess? What if I think that the best way to play chess is to take my king and smash it over your bishop and claim victory? I mean, this is still a subjective thing at base. You can always ask, says who? Whether it's an individual or a nation or even the whole world, says who? Unless you have that ontological grounding in the nature of God, it's still going to be subjective, and all of us deep down knows it's not subjective.
Great. Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I like that answer. Says who? Because that's a nice way to frame it when you're thinking, is this a reasonable argument? And then
right.
So that's a good point. And actually going back to that video, so that's what got me attention to you lately. So I just saw it was one Christian versus, I should say, 14 atheists and one temporal agnostic, Steve McRae. And one of the very first thing that you said in that video was the response to Kyle Curtis, which I thought was great, because he was saying that the Bible, all of these verses in the Bible, and not one mentions anything about rape. And so you pulled out the Bible and you read the verse on rape.
I always try to put something at the beginning of the video that's kind of a teaser to get people to stay, to watch the rest of the video. And that seems so low energy that I almost didn't put it there, but I've gotten so many comments on that. But it's funny that got your attention, the one verses 15 or whatever, because you know how we are as YouTubers, we want to have regular content. And right now I'm working on a Doctor of Ministry program, and it's eating up a lot of my time. And I've been traveling lately. I was speaking at Purdue University last week or 2 weeks ago. I've just had so much going on, but I'm trying to keep regular stuff coming out because people are saying that it's helpful and all that. And I'm shocked that anybody ever watches my channel, but I want to keep it coming out. So I was like, what am I going to respond to? And so I thought maybe one of these videos that are like questions that Christians can't answer. And when I found it, I was like, nobody's going to care about this, but I'll do it. But that's like now been one of the most immediately successful videos I've ever done. And it may not continue that way, but currently it was like 92% above average in terms of the viewer base in the early hours. And I'm shocked by that. I guess it's because all of those atheists were hitting things like, in the tags, their names are all hitting when people Google them or something. I don't know.
That's so true. And actually all of those atheists are very active atheists on YouTube. So you had a bunch of them, and they'd probably been waiting for more responses to that video because they made that a while ago, and there were a few initial responses and then it just sort of died down. So
yeah. Yeah, there's another one I found that people can find. I think it's I forget what this guy calls himself, but it's 78 questions for Christians or something. Most of them are overlap, but I may respond to that. I don't know. But funny thing was, I originally responded to a guy that had 20 arguments or 20 or something and I did this whole video and I sent it to some of my friends. And I found out later that after I already posted it, that Mike Winger, Cameron Bertuzzi, and John McCrae had all responded to that guy in a big group thing. So there's some overlap. We can't help but hit some of the same videos, but that's really my goal, is to respond, because YouTube is dominated by these atheist things in this realm. And there are just so few of us out there doing what you're doing, doing what I'm doing. And because people go to YouTube to find the answers to every question in life, whether that's how to fix my dishwasher or how to know whether or not there's a God, this is our new mission field. We so need people out there who know what they're talking about, trying to answer these questions. And that's just really what's on my heart. And I tell you, I really try to be friendly. I want to develop meaningful, cordial, at least, relationships with these skeptics and atheists. And I hope that to some degree I've accomplished that. But you can't help the fact that the Bible describes itself as an offensive weapon. And sometimes you're going to upset people. That's just the way it goes.
Yeah, no, that's true. It does. And I want to make a couple of comments here. I'm looking at the audience here, and Skylar Fiction rightly pointed out that, yes, I am on a green screen. Skylar, this is my office. I'm not in my office right now, but I took a picture of my bookshelf. So those are all textbooks behind me, in case you're wondering. And I also wanted to mention in the chat, I've been on channels with Skylar, and one of the other things that gets brought up a lot with atheists, that's a challenging argument that he brings up, is a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament. And I know Paul Copan has written some of this kind of stuff with God, the moral monster idea. And I was wondering if you've ever argued against anybody about other things that are in the Old Testament, like slavery, and of course we just mentioned rape.
Yeah, well, I've had debates with atheists, but I've never covered. I don't think that particular subject has come up, but I've talked about it a lot, and I'm happy to talk about it. I think what people are missing, there are three things. Number one is God is a God of love. That's absolutely true, but He's also a God of justice. And then the third thing I think that's important to plug in here is that death is not the end within a Christian worldview. So if someone is challenging the morality of God by looking at these Old Testament passages, they're doing an internal critique of Christianity. And often what we see our friends doing is they'll take a portion of what it says and then they'll talk about how awful it is without putting on the rest of the Christian worldview to properly do that internal criticism, that internal critique. But if you're going to do that, you've got to put on all the clothes of the Christian message to see if it's internally coherent. And so in order to do that, I say, okay, we look at, say, the slaughter of the Canaanites or something like that. All right, yeah, I get it. I totally understand how that sounds to someone. Now let's put on the Christian worldview and let's see if it's internally coherent. Okay, God is a God of justice. These people were warmongering, wicked, child-sacrificing people. God had given them hundreds of years to repent. That is a God of mercy. That is a God of love. But justice had to be done. And if I often use this, if we captured Hitler and we were to say about Hitler, hey, we're going to hug you and pat you on the back and say, hey, just don't ever do it again. That would not be just. That would be bad. That would not be a good thing. A good thing is that there is a just penalty for what Hitler did. We understand that. That's intuitive. In the same way, these child-sacrificing, warmongering individuals, there had to be a just penalty. Now, in God's case, He gave them hundreds of years to repent of this, and they never did. If He's going to be a good God, counterintuitively, justice has to be done. So He's a God of love, but He's also a God of justice. Now, next people will bring up, well, what about the presumably innocent people, the children and the people that haven't yet reached an age where they can think these things through, moral and ethical things? I get that, but you've got to understand whether we're talking about the flood or we're talking about this, or even things that happen in today's world with people like that. Death is not the end within a Christian worldview. Those people that die that way will wake up into the arms of a loving Savior. And so I think when you plug in not just God's justice and wrath and all of that, but if you plug in God's love and God's justice and that death is not the end, a lot of these things just dissolve. I think that's how you answer a lot of those questions.
I agree. And I think something that gives me a visual that I read in the books is talking about what the Canaanites did with their children as far as sacrificing them. the way that they did that, they would burn them in the arms of the god Baal, or Baal, however you say that. They would burn these little babies, and the babies would be screaming, and they would play music super loud so that people wouldn't hear the screaming of the babies. They would have the music very loud, and that kind of thing. And then they found child remains inside of parts of houses, and just, you know, really terrible things going on back then. And so God is better that they, I mean, it's actually better that you wouldn't, a society like that would not keep perpetuating. And I think that God helped the planet out by removing those people from this place.
Yeah, and like
transferring
you said,
their location, if you want to call it that, like Frank Turek would say, transferred them from this location to the next.
right. And so that's the kind of overarching answer. But like you said, Paul Copan's got a great work on this. And the fact is that, you know, he'll talk about how a lot of these were actually, you know, citadels or military outposts. And it wasn't as though you couldn't send those innocents away, and you know, these kind of things. So there's a lot that needs to be taken into consideration when you consider this. And people just dismiss it with such glib certainty sometimes, I think.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So you mentioned, now we talked a little bit about your debate with Matt Dillahunty. Have you been in any other debates, or what, if you haven't, what was one of your most challenging conversations with an atheist? Like, was it challenging talking to Shannon Q the other day?
Well, no, because with Shannon Q, I told her, I said, I don't typically do these online debates. There's people in the chat right now who have challenged me. A lot of people have challenged me. In fact, I had barely gotten home from the Dillahunty debate before I had at least 2 challenges to have online debates. And I just don't have any interest in that. There are a couple of reasons. One is, as you mentioned, I'm in administration at an institution of higher learning, and the board of regents would prefer that I not do online debates. The second thing about it is I put a lot into a debate. I mean, as we're experiencing right now, I can answer a lot of these questions, and I do it on my YouTube channel. But when I'm going to be discussing with someone, I'm like inspiring philosophy. I want to try to be as much of an expert on a particular issue as I possibly can be. And so I put a lot into that, and I just don't have time. I come to work all day. I teach classes. I am working on I have to make administrative decisions all the time and meet with people. I have to do my DMin work. And then at night, guess what? There's a blonde, a redhead, and a brunette at my house. That's my wife and my 2 daughters, who all want my time. And so often I have taken away from that time for YouTube or for academic related things. And I just don't have the time for it. And so and people can be so, I don't know, demanding, as if it's their right, like you owe it to them to have a debate with them. And fortunately, most of them have said, "Hey, I get it. That's great, man." And so that's just not my thing. I will debate in the future. I don't know what that's going to be. There's some talks about next year, a live public debate of some sort. And so I've got a couple of things in the works, but this debating every other night online this isn't really my thing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned inspiring philosophy, and I've had him on my channel too. He's wonderful, and I like what he does. Probably just what you do is when he's preparing for a debate. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into that. You have to study up on the topic. He actually goes and he looks at the videos of the people he's debating and tries to figure out strategies to respond. There's a lot of work. That's a lot of time.
And it is the case that, like, when I was preparing to debate Dillahunty, and this is no slight to Dillahunty, it's more about the amount of time that there is in the debate. You know, it's a timed event. But the fact of the matter is, I had prepared a huge document, a huge notebook with tabs for every imaginable thing. And if you watch it during the Q&A, you'll see me flipping open and answering a couple of the audience Q&A questions from my notebook, because I had prepared. But I could have, this is not a slight to Dillahunty. It has to do with the amount of time you have in a debate. But I could have walked into that debate the next day after I scheduled it and given the same, presentation, because it wasn't necessary. And a lot of debaters, atheist and Christian, will tell you, you don't end up using the vast majority of what you prepared for. That's one of the great things about the YouTube channel, though. I've been able to use a lot of that stuff that I studied in preparation for that debate to make atheist response videos. So, but yeah, I put a lot of time into it. I just don't have the time to be focusing on that. There's other things I have to be focusing on right now.
So what's one of your next projects that you're focusing on? Have you identified any funny videos that need to be responded to?
Actually, yes, I'll tell you about this. So someone mentioned to me in the last video, in the comments of the last video, or on Twitter or somewhere, that I should do a response video to Paulogia I did one topology on the Kalam, but he has one about how Christianity probably started or something. I think that's the name of it. And I listened to it, and it sounded like a good thing to respond to. So I'm going to work on that. But so in terms of YouTube, I've got that. I don't know that I have anything long-term out there that I want to do. I just started yesterday a series that's going to be an occasional series, maybe once every couple of months, on that I'm calling Sermons for Skeptics. So I've been trying to find out what sort of sermons do skeptics hate the most, and what will they most tolerate. And the reason I'm collecting that data is, you might say, well, why? Who cares? Well, because a lot of preachers put stuff in their sermons that skeptics hate that isn't necessary for the gospel. Doesn't have anything to do with the gospel. So it's kind of like the question of, what would it take for you to believe, that we often ask atheists, and the atheists often ask us, what would it take to convince you? I'm asking that, but with a few steps back. What would it take for you? What would it take for you to be open to listening to a sermon? And so I'm going to be releasing sermons from me and my pastor occasionally, like not regular, but occasionally over the next year, sermons for skeptics. And they're going to be sermons that I think will be most palatable. I know that I'm going to get a lot of vitriol, just like atheists know they may get a lot of Christian vitriol, but there are going to be hundreds of people who listen to these sermons who don't post in the comment sections, who are open. And as you probably had, I know I get somewhat regular, I don't want to overblow it, but somewhat regularly, I get correspondence from people who say, I'm either leaning Christian now and I've been an atheist, or now I'm a Christian because of your channel or Bertuzzi's channel or Winger's channel. And so I think God's going to bring some fruit out of that sermons for skeptics idea.
I love that idea. And I think I have had a few people respond like that too. It's just, even if one person out of all this time came to me and said, hey, I used to be an atheist. I had somebody on one of my chats who said, I was an atheist for over 20 years and I no longer am. And that was on the one with Mike Jones. So
that's fantastic.
Inspiring Philosophies. He's been doing a great job out there.
Oh yeah. I mean, the thing is, until I came into this realm of online YouTube stuff, which honestly, I know you're probably wanting to wrap up, so I'll just say this quickly, but about 3 years ago now, I've continually taught apologetics and been engaged in apologetics events, but I kind of got away from that world in terms of my personal interests and study, because I got personally convicted, I think by the Holy Spirit, that I had spent too much time focusing on apologetics and not enough on biblical studies and biblical scholarship. And so I spent about 3 years just going through the Bible and just trying to have a greater clarity and a greater biblical knowledge bank. So when I came back, the thing that had changed in that amount of time is all the apologetics that's going on online now on YouTube, with, like we said, with modern day debates and even atheist shows like, dare I say, Non Sequitur and things like that. And so as a result, it's been interesting and fascinating to study this. But what I found is, where the live public debate realm has their heroes and their, people that carry the standard, like William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, people like that. The online world has a whole different set, like Inspiring Philosophy and Mike Winger. And so that's been really interesting that these two things are happening at once. And really, again, I just want to reassert to Christians out there that YouTube is such a mission field, and we're in uncharted territory to a large degree. And to the atheists out there, we want to, at least I want to, and the people that I'm closest with, want to look at you and talk to you and about you and what you're saying as though we're talking to friends and family, because we know that you are someone's friend, someone's family. And whether you believe it or not, or think it's just pious blather, we love you, we care about you, and we don't mean to be condescending. We're not saying that we have it all figured out. We're saying there's Jesus, he's got it all figured out. And we're just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. So that's kind of how I think about these things.
Yeah, and you have a very kind approach. I really like the responses and the tender care you take when you talk to atheists.
Well,
and
thank you.
Even in that video with the 15 people. So I thought you had a very caring responses.
I get criticized from both sides. I get criticized from the atheists because they say I'm condescending, and then I get criticized from the Christians because I'm too not like overly nice, like giving away, like agreeing too much. But the fact of the matter is, I'd rather, I'm not for everybody, but I'd rather err on too nice than err on being a jerk, so that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think that's wonderful what you do, and that you've been out there doing that kind of stuff. I did want to see if the audience wanted to ask any questions. Would you be open to answering a couple questions?
Sure, yeah. If I can. Yeah.
Okay. So if I see any questions coming in, I will go ahead and ask. I also wanted to ask, since you were a pastor, one of the things and I read that you were a pastor in 2 churches. So I think that's pretty amazing. And I know I'm not supposed to do this, but a lot of times I'll say a prayer and I'll flip open the Bible. I know this isn't really what you're supposed to do, but for some reason, 9 out of 10 times over an entire year, almost every time I do that, I flip open to Luke 24, the road to Emmaus. And I know that there's probably something God's trying to tell me, because I don't think that that's normal. Although people have tried to tell me, well, hey, your Bible must have a tear right there, or that kind of. No, it really doesn't. This is what's weird about it. But yeah. What would you make of the road to Emmaus? This idea?
That's a good question. I don't know. That's a fascinating story and somewhat comical of a story. It
is.
It is falling in with these guys, and I don't know. It'd be hard for me to comment on that. I would just say spend time exegeting that passage and consider it. But it's funny you bring up I didn't know where you were going with that at first, but it's kind of the magic 8-ball approach where you open at random and what happens. And people disparage that. And I think in general, it's best, and you would say the same thing, it's best to have a regular study, through the scriptures.
Agreed.
Nevertheless, I've had moments like that where randomly I open it up and my eyes fell on something that was incredibly useful that way. So I don't discount it, but I don't know. I'd have to think that through. I'm tempted to say something like perhaps God is working in areas in your life where you don't recognize that He's at work, but I'm neither a prophet nor a prophet's son.
Yeah, no, that could be it. Or see, I was always thinking that it had to do with, He wants me to look into the Old Testament more, because one of the things He did in that Jesus did, was He pointed out all these Old Testament verses. And I was raised a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Baptist now, but I was raised a Catholic, and we really didn't read the Old Testament. I hate to say that. I went to Catholic grade school, and I only knew Genesis pretty much. So
yeah.
So well, I was on a plane once when I was trying to come back to. I spent 20 years away from Christianity, pretty much as a really weak Christian who questioned whether Jesus had resurrected. And suddenly I find myself next to a pastor on a plane. Now, who set that up?
Wow!
And the pastor convinced me to not only read C.S. Lewis's adult books like Mere Christianity, but he convinced me to go read Isaiah 53. And I read that passage and I thought, oh my gosh, this is crazy. This is completely Jesus 700 years before. How is this possible that this is in the Old Testament? So I decided I'd go look up the Jewish scriptures to see if it was in their books. I thought, well, this is just, to me, it just was screaming Jesus. And there lo and behold, it's in the Jewish scriptures too. It's just really amazing.
Yeah, that kind of takes us full circle back to the question about the Dead Sea Scrolls at the jump, right? That's how do you get out of that stuff? You can read some of that to people and not tell them. I think Mike Winger says he does this, that read it to them and don't tell them it's Old Testament, and ask them to comment, and they'll be like, well, it's just stuff about Jesus that blah, blah, blah. Well, hold on a second. You think that's about Jesus? That's interesting.
Exactly. And actually, I've done that on Twitter before. I've put it out there and I say, who am I describing? Did
it work? Did you get Jesus responses there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty funny. So I don't see wait, what can you then say? Okay, so I think that's John Joting, if I'm not mistaken. I see Prophet David McGuire. We got some great people here. We've got some others that were in here before. Osiris I see here, but I see the idea you can be an atheist and say morality is objective. What you can't say then is there is zero evidence for God. So
that's right. You can't say there's zero evidence for God. Is that what you said?
Yeah. If you say that morality is objective.
That's right. If morality is objective, that is an incredible piece of a case for God's existence. Yeah.
And it's good because otherwise, I was listening to a Frank Turek debate. Well, actually, it was a Frank Turek speech today. And one of the things I heard him say that I thought was good was he had a person in the audience who came up to him, and the person was just in tears pretty much. And he was a father of a girl who'd unfortunately been abuse, sexually abused from a man that the family had trusted for over a 10-year period between the time she was 4 and 14. And her 2 brothers became atheists because of that. And Frank said, well, if you become an atheist and you say there is no God, then you can't say that what they did was objectively wrong, because you just can say that what this person did is just a matter of opinion suddenly. And so you really don't want to say that there's no God because of something horrible that happened. So that was
he gives that in his debates sometimes, doesn't he?
Yes,
I think I heard that in the
Shermer
debate. Yeah. It's powerful.
It is.
You know, he's great. He's great at crafting, and some of my favorite apologists are not good at this. But he's great at crafting an opening statement that the audience can connect with, even if they have no knowledge of apologetic stuff, you know? And so he's a master at that.
Oh, he's really good. I was, and the same thing, I'll just mention one more thing that he said that I thought was pretty hilarious. Yeah. So he was talking about how the miracle of birth, and he said the miracle of conception. And he was talking about how this egg, the size of the top of a pin, or a period at the end of a sentence. And then he said the father sends these 3 million sperm, and so this is why you know that you're special, because you won.
That's good. The odds were already against it. But Turek, I heard him give that in person in Waco, where I had there was a conference that followed the Dillahunty debate. The Dillahunty debate was at Baylor University. Following that, there was a conference, the Unapologetics conference, and Mary Jo Sharp was there. Mark Middleberg was there, and Frank Turek was there. And that wasn't the first time. I'd met Frank Turek before, but that was the first time I really talked to him for very long. But I don't think Frank Turek was in the audience, but Mary Jo Sharp and her husband and a few other apologists and Mark Middleberg were all sitting out there in the audience when I was having that debate with Dillahunty. That gave me that was more pressure on me, I think, than debating Dillahunty, was knowing that these heavyweights are sitting out there in the audience. It was an amazing thing.
Oh yeah. And you've met a lot of them.
I'm the Forrest Gump. I'm the Forrest Gump of the apologetics world.
No, you aren't.
I've been with everybody. I'm the low guy on the totem pole that's met everybody.
That is hilarious. So I wanted to say, is there anything else that you would like to offer to the audience before we wrap up?
I don't know why I feel led to say this. I'm working right now on a major writing project for my D-men, and the focus is on using apologetics for discipleship. So lay believers in the church using apologetics to help people who experience intellectual doubt, who are also professing believers. So not toward atheists, and I've done work before on evangelism and apologetics. This is discipleship and apologetics. And one thing that I've found really helpful to say to any of your Christian listeners that are out there, I usually talk toward the atheists. So I'll take this opportunity to say to any Christians that watch this is, there are a lot of voices out there that will tell you that you shouldn't do apologetics until you have a degree in it, or you've read particular books or anything like that. And I understand why they say that, because they don't want you to go out there and say something wrong or act like you know more than you know. But you can be a Christian apologist today, even if today was the first time you ever heard of Christian apologetics, because even if you are not prepared to be an answer giver yet, you can currently be an answer finder for people. You can say to them, I don't know the answer to that question. Now, someone will say, yeah, but that would mean that I'm letting them know that I don't know. Well, that's right, because if you don't know, you don't know. And when I was a young preacher, I kind of picked up through osmosis from other preachers that you need to, if you're going to be a preacher, or if you're going to be an evangelistic Christian, you need to be able to thump the pulpit and say, thus saith the Lord, even if you don't know what the Lord thus saith about a particular thing. And that is catastrophic. You shouldn't do that. You should say, I don't know, but I'm going to go find the answer to that, and we can continue this conversation. So if you're out there and you're interested in the kind of things that you hear from SJ and from me and from other Christian apologists, and you say, man, I'd really like to do that, but I don't want to mess up and confirm someone in their atheism or confuse them or get something wrong, that's okay. The solution to that is, if you don't know, you say, I don't know. But you can be an apologist, because you can be an answer finder for people right after this video is done. And I encourage you to do that.
That's great. And that reminds me of something I wanted to ask you. If you had to recommend maybe 2 books to newbie Christians, people who are just sort of getting into it, or they're weak Christians who are like me for many years, which books would you recommend that they read? to answer people online?
People are probably going to think this is the most obvious answer, but, the Case for Christ is a great place to start. Obviously, there have been a lot of people who've come to Christ because of the Case for Christ. And some of the deep philosophical stuff that I really love is hard for some people. And the Case for Christ just deals with the resurrection, so it's easier. If you do want to recommend one that does include some of the philosophical stuff, Geisler and Turek's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist is a great book. But for someone who kind of has heard some of that basic stuff and they want to go a little bit further, still a pretty low shelf, bottom, not quite bottom shelf, but close to the bottom book. That this is not me tooting my own horn, but I wrote a book for this purpose called Core Facts. If people Google my name, go to Amazon and put in Braxton Hunter, you'll find this. I wrote a book called Core Facts specifically for this. I also have a fiction series that incorporates apologetics, which could be a good place to start. But I think the best place to start would be something like The Case for Christ or I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
We haven't even mentioned Lee Strobel, but he came to our church a few years ago before I had come back to,
Cool.
more than a few years, it's probably 7-8 years ago, before I'd really fully come back to Christianity. And I heard The Case for Christ. He makes a great case.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you real quick, a funny Lee Strobel story that will further entrench my Forrest Gump position. So I first met him when I was the president of the Conference of Southern Baptist Evangelists, and which is a denominational arm of the SBC endorsed by NAM, North American Mission Board. And so I got to go visit the site of the next annual convention, which that year was in Phoenix, Arizona. And I was going for the Winter Evangelism Conference. And one of the speakers was Mike Licona, who I already knew at that point. And one of them was Lee Strobel. And so Licona introduced me to Lee Strobel. And I was cavalier enough at that point to ask Lee Strobel if he had mentioned that in the beginning of The Case for Faith, his second book, he tells the story of a man named Charles Templeton, who was an associate of Billy Graham and a youth evangelist who became an atheist. And he kind of tells the story of that. Strobel told that he had heard that Charles Templeton had had a deathbed conversion after he had written The Case for Faith. So this isn't in Case for Faith. And he wanted to find that clipping, and he found it from a newspaper at one point, but couldn't locate it. And so I took this opportunity. I said, if I can find you that clipping about Charles Templeton's deathbed conversion, will you give me an endorsement for one of my books? And he surprisingly was like, yeah, I think so, but I don't think you're going to find it. I went back to my hotel room and found it in a matter of minutes, but I was too lazy to ever email that to Lee Strobel and take him up on that offer. So fast forward several years, and in 2017, I was at a conference with Lee Strobel, speaking at that conference with Lee Strobel. And I asked him, do you remember that? He said, I do remember that. And I said, I found it. And he said, you found it? I said, yeah. He said, well, email it to me. I said, well, I didn't save it, but I think I can find it again. And he said, you're not going to find it again. You just think you found it. He said, I'll tell you what, if you find it, when we make the film for The Case for Faith, I'll put you in the credits because I want to include something about Charles Templeton. So I went back to my hotel room and I found it. And I emailed it to Mark Middleburg. And I said, is this what you guys are looking for? And Middleburg was like, how did you find that? So it remains to be seen whether I'll end up in the credits for The Case for Faith. But that's my Lee Strobel story.
Oh, that's great. And I just read his A Case for Miracles book, by the way.
Oh, I haven't read it yet.
Oh, he's got some, there's a woman named Barbara Comiskey Snyder. I'll just mention this one really quickly because a woman that I converse with sometimes on Twitter knows this woman, Barbara Comiskey Snyder, because she's from your area. I think Barbara's from Indiana, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh.
And she in the, when was this? I think it was the early 1980s. She had a very bad case of MS. And she had gotten to the point where she was bedridden. She had to be moved around in a wheelchair. Her hands and her feet were basically crumpled up. And in the church that she attended, they all recognized her as being in a wheelchair and just her body had atrophied in quite a terrible way. Her muscles had done that. And then what happened was she was in this bed and she heard, my child, get up and walk. And she got out of the bed. The atrophy immediately went away. Her hands opened up. She was able to walk through the house. And that night she went into a church, her church. And when they saw her walking down the aisle, everyone stood up and clapped. And she's to this day still MS free.
Oh, praise the Lord. That's fantastic. I'll tell you, people say things like, well, you know, the prayer doesn't work, and there's the Templeton Foundation study and blah, 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 and all those kind of things. And I get it. I get it. And miracles don't, there's no evidence of miracles. Why aren't they happening now? And I think to myself, if you were a Christian, and I know that some of them say, you know, I used to be a Christian and all that, but most Christians I know who have been Christians for any length, like maybe 20 years or more, there have been so many things in their lives, so many answered prayers that were specific. And that it's just like when you say, well, prayer doesn't work or miracles, it's kind of like, I mean, okay, but I kind of have experienced it. Like, I don't know what to tell you. I've actually experienced it. You know, the near-death experience type stuff, you know, that Gary Habermas talks about. And I have a book, Death is a Doorway, where I talk about it. It really sounds like I'm hawking my books here, but I'm not trying to do that.
I'm going to put links to your books in the description.
Oh, I appreciate that. I have an Amazon author page. You could just link that. But I love near-death experiences, and some of them are really veridical, and they think they can handle it with, you know, talking about DMT and stuff that's produced in your brain and blah, blah, blah. But those don't handle the highly evidential cases with what we might call, for lack of better terminology, remote viewing and things like that. But you go into any church in America today, and I get it, that's a sample of religious people. That's fine. But go into any church in America today of any denomination, cessationist or continuationist, and ask them, how many of you yourself or someone you know had an interesting near-death experience or a moment when they were slipping off into death in hospice where they were talking about seeing these things or have evidential experiences about these things? Half the crowd will go up in any congregation. So when I hear people say we don't have this stuff today, I mean, I understand why someone would say that, and I get the criticisms, but at the same time, it's like, what are you talking about? This stuff is happening all over the place.
It is. And I love near-death experiences too. And in fact, I listened to part of Gary Habermas's video just yesterday. So yeah. On near-death experiences, I think
one from Capturing Christianity?
Yes.
Oh, that was fantastic. He has the best interviews.
He really does. Yeah. Cameron's amazing. I did want to mention something with that Templeton study before I let that go, because I looked into that study on prayer.
Oh, good.
And one of the reasons why that study did not work, and it's a very basic, simple reason, is because the control group here, they have two different groups in the study. They have a group that people were going under some surgery, and another group where people are going into some surgery. And in the first group, they decided they would have people from afar who didn't even believe in a God necessarily do these prayers from a distance, who also didn't see these people. And then the people in the control group were not prayed for by that same group of people. But my point is, both of these groups of people were going into surgery. Who's to say family members weren't praying for either group or both of them at the same time? Right. So why should, it doesn't mean the control group got no prayers. I mean, you're in the hospital.
That's a really good. No, I did not know that the group that was praying was comprised of people that weren't necessarily believers. But and that right there is you know, detrimental to the study. But the really interesting thing that you just said, so that I never thought about: how do you ensure that somebody's mama ain't praying for them? How do you ensure? Because if you told my mom, "Hey, we're doing an academic study, do not pray for your son," my mama's going to pray. I mean, come on,
that'd
man.
Probably make her pray more.
Right. That's right. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So good. So anyway, so just to wrap up here, I want to say thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you to you for coming on, Dr. Braxton Hunter. I think this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm going to put links into your website and to your Twitter account if people want to find you, and also to your Amazon account so that people can find you there and read these great books that you referenced.
Thank you.
And anything else you'd like to share?
Just how much I really appreciate that you would have me on. And of course, the most important thing, the reason that I do everything I do, and I know the reason you do, SJ, what you do, is because we believe that Jesus died on a cross for the sin of the world. And we believe that he loves you, whoever you are. And we're all sinners. And if you'll just repent and trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, you can be a part of the family of God. And if that sounds too preachy to you, don't let the fact that it sounds preachy subtract from the truth value of it. And so I would encourage you to do that. But again, SJ, thank you so much for having me on here. It's been an absolute delight, and I'll share it all over my social media as well.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to say one thing. It's never too late to all of those you who remember the Apostle Saul. Saul was busy persecuting Christians when Jesus encountered him on the road to Damascus and completely transformed him. So it's possible with everyone.
Amen. That's right.
All right,
Thank
well,
you,
thank
sister.
you. I'm going to go ahead and end this stream.